In the heart of the South Pacific, Paradise is lost to a violent mutiny. Captain William Bligh, a brilliant but brutal commander, is overthrown aboard the HMS Bounty. He and 18 loyal men are cast adrift in a tiny open boat, thousands of miles from safety, with only days of food. Their ordeal, a 41-day battle against starvation, raging storms, and utter despair. It is one of history's greatest voyages, a desperate fight for life on the edge of the world. A ship, smaller than a tennis court, tasked with carrying a fragile forest across the world's largest ocean. This was His Majesty's armed vessel, Bounty. Her mission wasn't one of war, but of botany, to collect breadfruit plants from the paradise of Tahiti and transport them to the West Indies as a cheap food source for slaves. At its helm was Lieutenant William Bligh, a master navigator, one of the finest seamen in the entire British Navy, a man who had sailed with the great Captain Cook. But Bligh was also a man whose praise was rare and whose fury was legendary. His sharp tongue could strip the dignity from an officer in front of the entire crew, a habit that would prove dangerously corrosive. After a grueling 10-month voyage, the Bounty dropped anchor in Tahiti in October 1788. For the next 5 months, the sailors lived a dream. The island was lush, the climate warm, and the Tahitians were welcoming. Many of the crew lived ashore, forming deep relationships with local women, embracing a life of freedom worlds away from the rigid discipline and cold, wet decks of a British naval vessel. But paradise has a price. On April 4th, 1789, the Bounty weighed anchor, its precious cargo of over 1,000 breadfruit plants stowed below deck. The dream was over. The return to the harsh realities of shipboard life was a shock. The simmering tension between Bligh and his crew quickly boiled over. Fletcher Christian, a young officer and once Bligh's protege, found himself the frequent target of the captain's tirades. The breaking point came over a pile of coconuts. Bligh, believing some were stolen, accused his officers, including Christian, of being thieves and damned hounds. Publicly humiliated by a man he once considered a friend, Christian seethed. He later angrily said, "I have been in hell for weeks with you." 3 weeks after leaving Tahiti, his decision was made. In the dark, pre-dawn hours of April 28th, Captain Bligh was ripped from his sleep. He was dragged onto the deck in his nightshirt, his hands bound tightly behind his back. A bayonet was at his throat. The face staring back at him was Fletcher Christian's. The ship was in chaos. Christian, his voice thick with emotion, cried out, "I am in hell! I am in hell!" He and his fellow mutineers had seized the Bounty. They forced Bligh and 18 loyal men into an open launch, a boat just 23 feet long. So overloaded, it sat mere inches above the waves. They were given a pittance of supplies, 150 pounds of bread, a small cask of water, a little rum, and a compass. As the launch was cast off, Bligh looked back at the ship he once commanded, sailing away towards the horizon. Ahead of him lay 4,000 miles of open, unforgiving Pacific Ocean. He had no charts, barely enough food for a week, and a crew on the brink of despair. Their journey for survival had just begun. The mutiny was over. But for Captain William Bligh and the 18 men crammed into a 23-foot launch, the true test had just begun. The Bounty, their former home, was a ghost on the horizon. Ahead lay 4,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean. The boat was so overloaded that the crest of each wave threatened to swamp them. They were adrift in a wooden coffin. The men stared into the endless blue, their faces masks of shock and despair. But Bligh was already working. The same obsessive precision that made him a tyrant on the Bounty now became their only hope. He took inventory. 150 pounds of bread, 28 gallons of water, a bit of rum and pork. It wasn't nearly enough. Using a pair of scales he'd made from coconut shells, he implemented a brutal rationing system. 1/25 of a pound of bread per day, a quarter pint of water. Each man's portion was a cruel joke, but it was the only way any of them might live. Their first attempt to find help was a disaster. They landed on the island of Tofua, desperate for food and water. At first, the natives seemed friendly, but soon their numbers grew, their mood shifting from curiosity to aggression. As Bligh and his men scrambled back to the launch, stones began to fly. One man, Quartermaster John Norton, tried to cast off the stern rope. He was swarmed, dragged onto the beach, and beaten to death. The others could only watch in horror as they rowed for their lives. The lesson was learned in blood. There was no safe harbor. Their only path was forward, across the open sea, toward the distant Dutch colony of Timor. From that moment on, they did not stop. They rowed and they bailed, their world shrinking to the rhythm of the oars and the constant fear of the next wave. Days bled into weeks. Savage storms lashed their tiny boat, forcing them to bail ceaselessly with their hats, their hands, anything, just to keep from sinking. The waves were mountains of dark water that rose above them, threatening to crush them in an instant. When the storms passed, the sun was its own form of torture, baking their skin and cracking their lips. Saltwater sores covered their bodies. Starvation became a physical presence in the boat, a hollow ache that twisted their insides and clouded their minds. Men grew weak, their bodies wasting away until they were little more than skeletons. Some slipped into delirium, muttering about feasts and streams of fresh water. They began to question Bligh, their whispers turning to open dissent. Why couldn't they try another island? Why must they follow this madman on his impossible course? This was Bligh's defining moment. He didn't offer comfort. He offered grit. With a storm raging around them and a near mutiny brewing within the boat, he grabbed a cutlass. He reminded them that he was their commander, and that their only chance of survival was his command. He navigated with a simple quadrant and a pocket watch, his calculations unerring even as his body failed him. He taught the men to trail lines to catch birds, to wring out their rain-soaked clothes for a few precious drops of fresh water. He described elaborate meals in vivid detail to distract their minds from their gnawing hunger. And after 41 days of hell on water, a miracle. On the horizon, a hazy line of green, Australia's Great Barrier Reef. They had crossed the empty heart of the Pacific. They were skeletal, ravaged, but they were alive. The journey wasn't over, but William Bligh, the deposed captain, had achieved one of the greatest feats of navigation and survival in human history. After 41 days of relentless torment, the sight of land was a hallucination made real. They had reached Australia's Great Barrier Reef. William Bligh and his 17 starving men were not just survivors. They were ghosts who had clawed their way back to the world of the living. They stumbled ashore onto a small island, their legs barely able to hold their skeletal frames. For the first time in over a month, they ate their fill: oysters, birds, berries. It was a brief, precious moment of paradise after an eternity in hell. But this was not the end. Their final destination, the Dutch colony of Timor, was still over 1,000 miles away. The last, most perilous leg of their journey was about to begin. They navigated the treacherous maze of the Great Barrier Reef, a feat that would challenge a fully crewed ship, let alone a tiny, exhausted launch. Then, it was back to the open sea. The men were at their breaking point. Sickness and despair were constant companions. Bligh, however, remained unwavering. He was no longer just a captain. He was the single thread holding their lives together. His iron will dragged them across the final stretch of ocean. On June 14, 1789, 47 days after being cast adrift, they saw it. The Dutch flag flying over the settlement of Kupang in Timor. They had done it. They had crossed nearly 4,000 miles of open ocean in a 23-foot boat. The locals who saw them arrive were horrified. They looked like specters, their bones sharp beneath their rags, their eyes hollowed out by starvation. But they were alive. Bligh's survival was astonishing, but his ordeal was far from over. He returned to England not to a hero's welcome, but to a court-martial, standard procedure for any captain who loses his ship. He was honorably acquitted, his logbook providing undeniable proof of his unparalleled seamanship and courage. With his name cleared, the wrath of the Royal Navy was unleashed. HMS Pandora was dispatched on a mission of vengeance, to hunt down Fletcher Christian and the mutineers of the Bounty. The Pandora found 14 of the mutineers living on Tahiti, but Christian and the ship were gone. They had vanished. The captured men were thrown into a makeshift prison on the Pandora's deck, a cramped cage they called Pandora's box. The hunt for Christian continued, but ended in disaster when the Pandora struck the Great Barrier Reef and sank, drowning 31 of its own crew and 4 of the captive mutineers. As for Fletcher Christian, he and 8 other mutineers, along with Tahitian men and women, had sailed the Bounty to the remote, uninhabited Pitcairn Island. To ensure they could never leave and never be found, they ran the ship ashore and set it on fire, watching the vessel that started it all burn to the waterline. Their fate would remain a mystery to the world for nearly 20 years. The legend of the mutiny on the Bounty would forever be defined by 2 men. Fletcher Christian, the romantic rebel who disappeared into myth, and William Bligh, the brilliant, brutal captain. A man whose tyranny cost him his command, but whose incredible skill in the face of impossible odds cemented his place not as a villain, but as one of the greatest mariners to ever sail the sea. If you enjoyed this true survival story, subscribe and stay tuned for our next video.